This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.
Welcome to the Toronto Region Board of Trade's Hit Go podcast. I'm the board's president and CEO, Jan De Silva. We're going out with a bang. Our climate economy mini-series finale brings in authoritative voices on the topic of financing. It's all well and good to talk about initiatives, mandates, and emission targets, but to bring an idea into reality, you need money. As innovative as a project can be, without capital, you're revving the motor with the handbrake on. This panel has two leaders from different organizations who are in the thick of massive decarbonization projects. One is former Federal Minister of Transportation, Tony Valeri, who now leads funding and government relations for ArcelorMittal Dofasco's Decarbonization Investment Project team. If you aren't a Hamiltonian or familiar with AMD Dofasco, they're Canada's largest flat steel producer with over 5,000 employees. The other is Scott Mabury, the VP of Operations and Real Estate Partnerships and the Vice-Provost of Academic Operations at the University of Toronto. While University of Toronto's academic gravitas are well known, they're keen on climate efforts as one of our region's largest landowners and public sector emitters, which you may not have known. Rounding out the panel is Ehren Cory, the CEO of the Canada Infrastructure Bank. CIB is financing investments across the country in major infrastructure projects with a mandate to support climate economy sectors. Sectors like building retrofits, clean energy, electric buses, charging infrastructure, and transit. As always, an alumnus of the board and passionate climate policy expert, Craig Rutan is our host, guiding the conversation to realistic timescales and payback periods, what a smart investment looks like, differences in approach in the U.S., and much, much more. We hope you enjoy it.
Ehren, I'd like to start with the first question for you. There's a lot of businesses and organizations that have money they can lend and invest, banks, pension funds, venture capital. So why does the Canada Infrastructure Bank need to exist?
Well, that's quite the starting question, Craig. Thank you. First of all, our needs are great. We face as some call it, an everywhere all at once sort of problem, don't we? We need to change our electricity system and get to clean electricity. We need to decarbonize our energy sector. We need to make transformation in our industrial sector, as Tony and colleagues like he and industries like steel and cement and plastics know. We need to change the way we heat and cool buildings. We need to get mass transit working for people and change our fleet systems. We need to ensure our economy is productive through better trade, ports, movement of goods and people. That's a lot. So I've never heard anyone say we have too much money thrown at the problem. So I think I'm pretty sure there's an important role for the CIB to play. The thing to think about just for a second, Craig, when we talk about infrastructure, which is a pretty broad definition of shared use, shared benefit kind of assets, right? Infrastructure is a really unique beast. First of all, what you can define infrastructure as, if you think about it, they're really long-lasting generational assets. They live. I'm a young guy, but most infrastructure investments we're making at the CIB will outlive me. They are meant to make long-term societal change. Number two, they're expensive. Most of them are really, really costly. Third, all of them deliver some mix of, they're, as you say, lots of other people can invest money. Those people invest money to make money generally. Infrastructure assets are challenging economically. And the reason they're challenging economically is because they have public good to them, right? So part of why we do them isn't just to make money, it's to deliver a public good. Public transit is not a classic moneymaker, is it? It's a business that delivers significant benefit in commute times and quality of life and decarbonization of our transportation. So they deliver other benefits. And lastly, they're really risky and uncertain, because do any of us really know with great certainty what future gas prices will be, future commutes will look like in our society, what future trade patterns will look like. So they're very, given how long a length they are, they're also really uncertain and risky. So if you take expensive, long lasting, highly uncertain, and deliver a mix of, yes, revenue potential, but also public good, if you take those four factors, it's pretty obvious that our traditional financing tools aren't really designed to solve those kinds of problems. And that's where something like the CIB can come in, and where we can help reduce the cost of a project through a loan that's long-term, patient capital, low-cost capital, and risk-sharing capital. So at the CIB, we're thinking about how do we structure an investment product in a way that fits that infrastructure asset class I just described. And that's very different than what pension funds and banks and humans and individuals and organizations like Dofasco or U of T would be doing. We're trying to partner with them to help address exactly those issues or close those gaps.
Thanks for that explanation. And that leads us up well to dive into some of those specific projects. Two leaders here who have whose organizations, as Ehren just mentioned, are leading some massive decarbonization work on their own. Tony, I'd like to start with you here. What is Dofasco doing to reduce its emissions, and where are you getting the money to do it all?
Thanks, Craig. Well, what we're doing is eliminating coal. Right now, we are making iron with a coal-based system, the traditional integrated steelmaking approach, and transitioning to natural gas initially. And as we continue on our path to net zero, cleaner fuel like hydrogen or renewable natural gas or some other type of clean fuel. The project itself will eliminate approximately 3 million tons of CO2. That's about 60% of our annual GHGs. The dollars themselves, $900 million, is coming from the federal and provincial governments. $400 million from the federal government from the Strategic Infrastructure Fund Accelerator Fund, or Net Zero Accelerator Fund, and the balance, $500 million, is coming from the province of Ontario, with the rest of the funds coming from ArcelorMittal. So this is an approximately $2 billion project. So, the majority of the funds are coming from the organization itself. Because we're a large multinational and certainly see the value in decarbonizing. Not only, when Ehren talked about the societal good, there is definitely a public interest aspect here, but the market is also moving in that direction. Our franchise business is automotive, and so clean steel or low carbon intensity steel as part of a supply chain for EVs in the province of Ontario, I think, is very critical component of that important supply chain.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tony. And we'll get into some more details later. I want to keep digging into that. But first, Scott, I'd love to hear from you about the University of Toronto's emissions reduction plan and how that came together.
We have been on this path for a long time. Nobody at the University of Toronto wants to pay the utilities anymore. So it's a very easy place for us to divert money from a utilities budget back into the classroom. That's our a major driver. We brought a green revolving fund in about 10 years ago. It did amazing things, converting buildings like our medical sciences building or our Robarts Library from a constant volume building to a variable volume building, that we monitor it for actual occupancy and run it for occupancy. And the payback on those $2 to $3 million per project cost was less than 3 years, and had lots of support for that. And that green revolving fund continues. We're the third largest emitter in the broader public sector in Ontario. So what we do matters, but we also have 110,000 or so faculty, staff, students who have committed to, by 2050, having the University of Toronto St. George campus be climate positive. And what we mean by that is net negative, not just net zero, net negative. We have a geo-exchange project, the largest in urban Canada, about to open at the end of August. It'll save us 15,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide per year. We're building student residences. The University of Toronto Scarborough, for example, is building a passive house, the largest passive house design building in North America, as I understand it. There will be 750 students there. We have another student residence on this campus with energy efficiency that effectively is going to be a net zero building, also tapping into yet another geo-exchange project. And then, of course, we have Project LEAP. This is our low emissions accelerator project that we're partnering with Canada Infrastructure Bank. It's going to reduce our carbon emissions by north of 60% and advance by 10 years our 2050 plan. We have a 2050 plan. It's been costed. We know exactly how to get there. This partnership with CIB is advancing that by 10 years. And so these are a key elements of how we're going to get to where we're getting.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. That was great to hear about all the things that U of T is doing and the big project underway right now. One of the things I notice about the difference between the project, Tony, that you're working on with ArcelorMittal and Scott, University of Toronto, is the different sources of financing that for U of T's Project LEAP, some of that financing is coming from the CIB. Dofasco, Tony, you mentioned the Net Zero Accelerator Fund directly from the federal government. So some of these different pots of money or different sources of this financing, and I don't always know the rationale for why it's coming from maybe one pot as opposed to from a different source. Ehren, can you help explain maybe some of the thinking of what makes a certain project better suited for some type of financing over another?
For sure, Craig. Thank you. And it's a great question. And I know it's one that often, if you're on the project side of things, it can feel, as you say, a bit overwhelming or confusing. The best way to think about it, I think, is, like a pyramid. And at the top, we would all, if we're trying to get as much built as we can, what we need to do is stretch every dollar as far as we can. So how do you do that? Well, at the top of the pyramid is private capital. And I agree with you asked in your opening question, sort of, why does the CIB exist? Let's be clear. There's lots of infrastructure in this country that gets built privately. The broadband that the four of us are using for this conversation today, we're all in urban centers. We're probably on an ISP's network that was privately built, good old-fashioned entrepreneurial spirit who decided they could make a return on investment good enough that they went ahead and did it with fully private capital. The more infrastructure we can build that way, the better, because that allows us to use what are pretty scarce and highly stretched public dollars on the stuff that need it the most. Our public school system, our health system, places that don't have private investors in them, yeah? So that the top of the pyramid is private capital, but there are a lot of blended things in the middle that you need to use if you're going to actually get really long-term, really risky projects built. So I would say the CIB is the next tranche underneath purely private capital. We are making loans or equity investments. Although we're using public taxpayers' money, we're doing that in pretty commercial ways. Now, our lending rates are less than you'd get from private markets. Our equity rate of return hurdle is much lower than you would get from a private equity firm. So we are, let's call it a preferred source of capital, and we're using taxpayers' money to provide that concessionary finance. That allows a project that's close to being doable in let's call it in classic market terms, but for its level of risk or its years of payback to happen. And Scott's project is a great example of that. Scott talked about utility bill savings. There's a great case for a bunch of the things that U of T is doing to do them, and they have payback on their own, and U of T is doing them on their own. Then there's another tranche, though, of things that are more expensive to do, take longer to pay back, and have more uncertainty to them, where Scott, with his budget, and he's got limited dollars, he's got tuition, he's got money that comes in from his students, he's got a business they're running. I mean, it's an institution of higher academic learning, but it has a financial structure to it, if you will. There's another tranche of projects that are hugely impactful, like LEAP, but that if they were left to do them on their own with payback terms that they are, and if they rank their projects, let Scott talk to this, from top to bottom, this is a hugely important one, but it's not the one you would do first. And by the CIB's money coming in, we're allowing them to do that, as Scott said earlier. So that's that middle tranche. And there are other tools. SIF is a great example. Tony talked about the Strategic Innovation Fund, which is a partner program of ours. They actually make a really interesting mix of loans and forgivable loans. So I don't know what Tony's structure is, but often SIF will do something where they make a loan, and a portion of that loan might be forgiven if you achieve certain performance thresholds or benchmarks. So that, if you think about it, is a tranche more of public financing than a CIB loan. And then at the very bottom of the stack is is a grant, a good old-fashioned government-funded infrastructure, which is how we build a lot of stuff in this country. Our highway network, a lot of our transit, our schools, our healthcare system, a lot of it. So if you think of the pyramid that way, blended finance tools, of which both the CIB and something like the Strategic Innovation Fund from the federal government would be two examples of, are meant to play in that middle. And I often say, there's lots of tools in the toolkit. It's our job to try and use all of them to get the most stuff built that we can.
Yeah, Scott, your thoughts?
I want to leap in a couple things. Just as Ehren said, the CIB is de-risking our project. But one of the major benefits is the fact that our LEAP project, yes, CIB is funding about 40% of it. U of T is doing about 10, but the private sector is doing half. So it's the partnership aspect of accessing the expertise, the innovation from the private sector with us, the public sector, a university that plans to be here forever. So we can handle long-term paybacks. But that discipline, and even on this project and innovation, we tap into knowledge that we don't have. Namely, when we went to market for our partner, we said, we want to save about 45,000 tons of CO2 per year. That our private sector partner, which we haven't quite announced yet, but we have selected, came back with, you can do so much better. We have some other ideas. So we're going from saving 50% of our emissions, 45, to 64%. So an extra 9,000 metric tons of carbon. That would have cost us, 10 million in other kinds of projects to gain those savings. But they brought innovation, some very creative thinking to the table. And whether we're doing these projects, whether we're building student residences, we're doing all of these through joint ventures with the private sector because we have skills and assets. They do as well. And the combination is delivering value for us.
I love that value of partnership and how much extra value that can add. Tony, how important was that partnership aspect to you in terms of being able to get this project moving forward?
The partnership level, the partnership with the two levels of government was critical to attracting the project to Canada. I think just to Ehren's point earlier on that pyramid of available supports, I think for large multinationals who do have access to dollars, what's really important is the non-repayable structure that exists in the SIF contracts, right? So this concept that, if you're hitting a certain carbon level intensity, or if you're maintaining a certain level of investment, or if you're maintaining a certain level of employment, that those types of that type of criteria is linked to the dollars that are being invested in the project. Because the ROI for projects like this are critically important for the private sector. And so SIF brought that opportunity to provide non-repayable portions of funding to large multinational, in this case, Dofasco. But that partnership itself, I think that what we need to keep in mind is that, while climate change and the shift is global, we're competing with the rest of the world for capital to invest here in Hamilton, Ontario. It's a question of speed, right? I think, people talk about net zero, 2050. The real issue here is at what pace. And I think Canada has decided that from a large industrial perspective, we want to see accelerated decarbonization in our large industrials. And that only happens with partnership at both levels, provincial and federal. And that's what's happened here at Dofasco. Result of the investment by the federal government and the provincial government accelerated the investment for ArcelorMittal. We're now the first globally for ArcelorMittal to decarbonize our primary side of the steel business here in Hamilton.
That's incredible. I'd like to dig into this idea of the timescale and the return on investment a little more, because that seems to be one of the big advantages of these partnerships and the blended finance models. But how important is that timescale and the return on investment? And is there any shifting in terms of from the private sector or the institutional perspective of how long that payback period is and changing that assessment? Or is it really about bringing more capital to the table and creating that product where the same return can be realized on the original sort of desired time scale?
It's a really interesting question, and there's probably not one answer because I think different companies or different institutions are taking different views to it. I've heard Scott say before, the U of T plans to be here forever. It is a public institution with a long life, and I think Tony would say a similar thing about Dofasco, given its history in Hamilton, and it's a true going concern which plans to be there for a long, long time. And I think companies and institutions like that do take long-term views of and understand the long-term realities of us all needing to get to net zero. 2050 feels incredibly far away, but it's actually sooner than we think. What I would say, though, Craig, it's not just about the long time frame. It's that, but the uncertainty that comes with it. That's the real challenge. And I mean, let me give you a practical example. Not either of their two businesses, but another investment the CIB has been making that I think is a great illustration of this around electric vehicle charging. So if you look around the world, businesses are springing up to provide fast level, what we call level 3, very fast speed electric charging infrastructure on our highway networks, the gas stations of the future, right? So you're driving from point A to point B and you need a charge. You're not in your driveway and you're not at your place of work, which is where a lot of charging takes place, of course, but this is en route, you need a charge. And this is going to be our future at some point. There's lots of businesses springing up around that idea. Those businesses, though, depend fundamentally on what's the rate of adoption of EVs, and how quickly that happens. It depends on global supply chains for electric vehicles, which we've seen have been really challenged in the last few years. It depends on consumer patterns that none of us quite understand right now. How are people going to drive in the future? How much of the time are they going to be looking for a charge out of the home? And are they willing to wait 20 minutes while a charge happens? So there's consumer behavior, there's supply chain stuff. If you, Craig, you and I started a new business setting up EV chargers, we might make money, but it's really hard to know how quickly we will and when. So what the CIB is doing, how do you think of blended finance of solving that problem? We would lend money to an electric vehicle charging infrastructure provider, and we would say, build out your network and do it fast. Because by the way, one of the things that's going to determine this, it's a network effect, just like the old fax machine. The more chargers we build, the more EV adoption there'll be. The more EV adoption there is, the better the chargers infrastructure will do. Yeah. So we're saying to people, go out and build out that infrastructure way faster than you would have otherwise. And don't pay us back at first. And don't even pay interest at first. And as the chargers get more utilized, and we'll measure this together, as you start to break even as a business, you'll start to pay us interest. You'll start to pay principal back. Over time, as the chargers get busier and the business actually starts to be profitable, our interest rate will go up. And that'll happen a few times to the point where eventually the partner will pay us back, take us out, and go get private financing because we actually might end up being more expensive than a bank or private lender. So the idea, though, is that our money can be the bridge of that uncertainty and of that risk. And that's when you talk about long-term and paybacks, that's the challenge for so many people. The challenge is, I know this thing will make money eventually. I think Tony would say having clean steel is going to be a competitive advantage in the market. And it's going to allow the sustainability and the long-term life of that facility in a globally competitive world. The challenge isn't that. The challenge is the 10, 15, or 20 years between now and then when it's uncertain how markets are going to shake out. And are you going to get credit? Are you going to be able to charge a premium price to your customers because you've got a cleaner steel? Eventually we are going to be, I think, because the market's going to have to go there. As Tony said, car companies are going to have no choice. But are they going to get there in 5 years or 10 or 15 years? That's the uncertainty gap that I think finance needs to help bridge.
And I would agree, Ehren. I think this period of transition that we're all embarking upon as we, decarbonize, is wrought with uncertainties, and so we need a level of certainty from a framework perspective, from a government perspective, creating the right conditions for the investment. When you look at large multinationals, we've got choices, right? We could invest in Canada, or we could invest in the United States and bring our substrate to Canada, to finish in Canada, to provide the galvanized steel and the other type of high value steel for the automotive sector. And so it's not only financing, but I think at the end of the day, governments need to bring forward the right regulatory framework. They need to think about contract for difference as we shift to clean energy. The price of clean energy, is it available at scale, at a competitive price? So I think it starts with attracting the capital, but to sustain the investment over a period of time and through this period of transition, there are a number of other elements that governments need to come to the table with in order to give the confidence of, for large corporations and corporations generally to make the investment, because it is a time scale, as you indicated, that is not just a 3-year, but could be a 5, 10-year, 15, 20-year time frame that we're operating in.
And for an institution like the University of Toronto, we do exist on a different time scale. We have energy and design build standards. When we build a building, it's for 100 years. That means it needs to be repurposable every 50 or so. That means we think about resilient infrastructure. We also have a very specific budget model, and universities do this differently, but we very strategically put in the hands of the deans the decision-making power, because that's where the University of Toronto's budget comes from. Students, as Ehren said earlier, well, students pay their tuition. We allocate that tuition and the government grant attached to where the action is at the faculty level, the medicines, the arts and science, the engineering. Well, they're the ones we've also put in their hands the cost of running their buildings. And so when I went in front of the dean 7 or 8 years ago and said, you're spending about $6,500 a square meter to build a building, and if you spent an extra $400, I think that was a number at the time, you could reduce the energy use of this building significantly and pay for that within 10 or so years. They said, do it. I then came back a couple of years later, and as we know more about climate change, and I'm a professor of environmental chemistry on the side, so I understand this, but the institution understands this, we removed the payback period limitation. So if there's a payback, doesn't matter how long, we will make that investment. We have extremely high energy efficiency standards, and that has paid big dividends for us. It also saves and allows us to address our deferred maintenance liabilities, which are approximately $1 billion. The Project LEAP project is going to save us $30 million in deferred maintenance costs. So there are many ways effectively to get these things funded, but our long-term awareness and our sense that we're going to be here for a long time, as well as the University of Toronto's role in being a globally impactful university and one that has influence, we do look long-term. And so we're less susceptible to needing to think super short-term. But nonetheless, this is providing other models for others to follow.
Well, thank you all. This has been a fantastic episode with lots of great insights. I just wanted to close out today's conversation by giving each of you a chance to offer a piece of advice to an organization or a company who might be thinking about how they can reduce their emissions and what it might take for them to get the financing in place to make that investment. So what's one piece of advice you might offer to someone in those shoes?
Well, let me start. I want to talk about the CIB a bit because it's been such a productive partner for us, and perhaps for others listening in the public sector, because it wasn't obvious how the CIB partners with the public sector, and we had to work through some things. But our journey started on a Sunday in the winter, and I got an email from Divya Shah saying, University of Toronto is a pretty good place. We have some programs. Would you care to have a chat sometime about possibilities? And I wrote back, how about now? And we had a very good Sunday afternoon discussion that kicked off, a very productive, very efficient, taking advantage again of a partnership where the different parties bring different assets and knowledges to the table. University of Toronto took the view that we need to do this in a generic way so that other universities and other public sector can also participate. So we didn't hatch just a U of T solution, but this has been really just a fabulous example for us. It has impressed our board, a board that's replete with private sector leaders, chief operating officers of things like KingSett, other major players from Brookfield, et cetera. And they have been universally impressed with the quality of the partnership that we brought them for approval. So that was a journey that we count as a highlight, frankly, over the last 10 years of our really starting off on a journey towards 2050 and our climate positive plan.
Thanks, Scott. Tony.
Craig, I think what I would say is, let me start off by saying, transition and change is sometimes very uncomfortable. I'm going to take it down and not speak from a multinational level, because I think if you look at the Canadian makeup, and if you look at Canadian makeup of manufacturing, it's predominantly small, medium-sized organizations. And so I think large manufacturers know how to engage with government and know how to navigate their way through where the supports are and where the help is. But I think for small and medium-sized manufacturers in Canada, you should know that make the commitment to decarbonization, to lower your carbon intensity. Know that governments are there to support. But I think there are also organizations that governments have created that also can be available. I think of the Advanced Manufacturing Supercluster in Ontario, NGen, as an entity for manufacturers to go to with their decarbonization challenges. Help is there. I think it's finding those organizations, or perhaps having the Toronto Board of Trade work with these organizations to inform the membership as to where the help is in order to find support for their decarbonization plans. These are expensive plans. There's a lot of uncertainty, and there's a lot of support required. And for the smaller and medium-sized organizations in Ontario and certainly across Canada, knowing and finding the support is going to be a critical piece to help them embark on this journey of decarbonization.
Great piece of advice. Thanks, Tony. And final word to you, Ehren.
Sure, thank you. And I agree completely with both colleagues and their comments. And Scott, I thank you for the plug. I really appreciate it. And it has been a great partnership. We feel the same way. And as Scott said, really trying to set up a path for how to work with other public institutions. In many ways, the U of T experience is a benchmark for us. If I was giving advice, and I love Tony is absolutely right to think of our economy to make the transition. Our bigger challenges in many ways are in the small and medium business, which is the engine of our economy. So I think your points are right on, Tony. All I would add is that the big barrier in many ways is uncertainty. It's like people are, there's a new tax credit. I don't understand how it works. There's maybe this contract for difference thing coming. I don't know what's going to happen to the carbon markets in the next years. I don't know what's happening to my current utility bills. They sure are going up, but how much? Uncertainty is a real paralyzer. And anyone who's delivered any kind of big project or made big change, as Tony said, change is hard. So anyone who's gone through that can get really stuck and maybe paralyzed by uncertainty. And so my advice is to start from skipping all that. Start at the end point. So I know Scott, the U of T have their Vision 2050. It's really helpful for organizations to, and Tony, I think similarly, you guys as a company have thought about what's the end state? Where do we have to be? And you can get very hung up on the uncertainty, but the end point's really clear. You're going to need to be a steel company that's manufacturing to be in a net zero world. We're going to have inputs that are carbon neutral or close to it that allow us to be net zero. So you can actually skip some of and then work backwards and then figure out what does it take to deal with some of that uncertainty. And that's where a tool like the CIB can be really useful to say, you have a great plan, but for what's in the way of it, now let's figure out how we can help support that. But that's not just us. We're one tool in the toolkit, Craig. I would say the same thing if you were going to approach the provincial government for a grant, if you were going to talk to, or if you were just going to your own shareholders and say, I want to put $1 million into blank. The best way to do that pitch, I think, is to start from the end vision and then work backwards. And there's this valley of uncertainty, which is stopping a lot of us from making what we know ultimately are the right investments and the right decisions. And if you do that, then you can start to be, I think, more surgical in understanding, well, what is that uncertainty and how can I deal with it? How could partners like the CIB or others help me to mitigate it? What can I do to sort of take smart risk and to get through that valley of uncertainty? That would be my advice.
Thank you. Thanks to all three of you for a fascinating conversation and really highlighting the benefits and values of partnership to make these great projects happen. So Scott, Ehren, Tony, thanks again.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Craig.
Thank you.
That's a wrap on the Toronto Region Board of Trade Hit Go podcast Climate Economy miniseries. Hopefully these conversations were as thought-provoking and inspiring for you as they were for my team. We're beyond ready to think about climate action in bold, ambitious new ways. With our region's bench strength, it's time for us to take our role as a global leader seriously and act. Please stay subscribed to this podcast on your favorite platform so you never miss a future mini-series. While this one is done, podcasts have a long life online, which means we'd still appreciate a review to boost our visibility and reach. Be sure to share our episodes with your network and check out BOT.com for more info on our Climate Economy Strategic Council. Thanks again for listening. We'll be sure to invite you to the next Hit Go conversation.
This is Story Studio Network.